All right, sounds good. Well, let's see, it's a little bit early my time. It's one of those in-between hours at 4 a.m. I'm here in the Bay Area. Um, but thank you for having me. I met Oscar in Shanghai a number of years ago, and I think it's amazing that we stayed in touch just a little bit. And so thank you for thinking of me and having me. Oscar asked me to speak about sort of what it means to be a CFO at a startup. He asked me to speak about how I went sort of from being sort of a CFO to entrepreneur. So just wanted to share a little bit about how I came to, be where I am today. A lot of it was not necessarily intentional, but just a little bit about sort of how I got started. I'm from here in the Bay Area. I started, if you go to the left, I'm Chinese American. I was born and raised here in Piedmont, California, which is where I live now. I put a little icon of like a violin on there because I was like a very sort of typically Chinese American kid. I played the violin. I swam, no balls to injure my head, right? I studied really hard from a young age. I was going to be a doctor, right? Hence, like the little pre-med sign over there. I was a pre-med in college. I went to Stanford. And so I kind of, did everything the way I was supposed to do things. Was maybe two classes away from actually applying to med school, but I kind of had interests more in political science and econ, really came around to thinking, well, I'm not really sure that I want to be in med school or in some form really for the next 10 years to be studying. And then, it's like a very prescribed track. Instead, so what I did next is I was like, well, I'll do a master's in East Asian studies. I had a longstanding interest in Chinese politics, Chinese reform, and fundamentally how did 20% of the population go from being sort of in the throes of many things to being very fairly prosperous today, right? I kind of landed a little bit randomly into the business world. So I, almost by accident got an internship with Morgan Stanley in Hong Kong, all the way to the right. Ended up joining McKinsey in New York, worked in private equity at KKR, and had also, traveled around the world, worked in, quite a number of places, worked or studied in quite a number of places. So I was, been very fortunate, and was also also fairly conscious about being associated with, institutions, right? Because that's kind of the way you're supposed to do it. I will say that they were, very good places sort of be trained professionally. So I did that from when I graduated and up until 2011. And then, I joke that kind of all fell apart a little bit, right? So I took this crazy job in 2011 where I built a hospital in China, about 3 hours away from Shanghai. That's how I originally got to know Oscar. And we, had basically a plot of dirt and we built this 500-bed hospital, which is still operating today. And that was really like my first startup, if you will, although not necessarily what you think of when you think about a startup, is where you think about software and apps and technology and so on and so forth. But this is really my first startup, and they asked me to be the CFO. I didn't really, honestly, I didn't really know what that meant, but I feel like at the time I was like, okay, well, I can probably go figure it out. I talk about that experience at length, but it was a very, very challenging experience, and also a very character forming experience. And then the second startup I did, I was also the CFO. I took over this company called 21 Inc., which was heavily funded, had like a lot of press about it, but was actually a very, very distressed company, because they basically raised too much money, had a huge amount of kind of debt burden, had a lot of press to kind of live up to. And so we took over a company with negative 50 million on its balance sheet in terms of all its liabilities, with no working product, no functioning team. And we had to both get out of all of that, And we ended up starting an entirely new company in that, which Earn, and then ended up selling that to Coinbase. So kind of joke that, these two sort of experiences, a lot of the time I was like, well, I don't really know anything about building a hospital, right? I don't really know anything about Bitcoin mining hardware. And then starting a company where you're basically selling, pay per email response. Well, I don't think anyone really knows anything about that per se. And so, what does being a CFO have to do with any of this, right? And then now I've started a couple of other a nonprofit and a for-profit related to pandemic stuff. But anyways, so so for me, I've never actually considered myself as being a CFO. I kind of fell into that position because here were some of the things that I considered be my core skill sets. And then in the situations I was in, the way that was the most useful was, I suppose, taking on the role of being a CFO, right? And so, what are those things? Thinking pragmatically, right? Thinking in a structured way, being able to solve business problems that are sitting in front of you, doing that in an analytical way. For me, I've always seen a lot of stuff happening in the business world, and really, particularly in the startup world, is really just being applied common sense. In my view, sort of, a startup is ultimately a business. And a lot of the business principles that you learn, for large companies is actually very similar to what gets applied with small companies. Part of the big difference being in a large company, obviously things are very established. There's an existing business model. In a small company, you're looking for product market fit. But a lot of the things that sort of drive product market fit and whether you're going to be successful, to me, are it actually can't be that complicated. Otherwise, it will never scale, right? And then, the other big difference between working in the very large institutions, which I've done plenty of, and being in a startup situation is that you're just willing to do what it takes, because startups, they all look like this when you start, right? And so, if there's an expectation for existing structure, then there isn't a whole lot to stand on. So you kind of sort of got to do the bootstrapping yourself, of course, right? So as I kind of went into these situations, the way I ended up being the CFO was, I always approached the situations and companies I was working in as sort of, how could I be the most useful, right? And so, thinking pragmatically, thinking in a structured way, being analytical, looking at problems. For a CFO, I think, one of the conceptions people have is that you're just managing money, right? You're doing spreadsheets, crunching numbers, and, there's like the stereotype, there's kind of like the green eye shade accountant sitting behind a desk and like, doing your numbers, right? So I think that perception can exist and comes from the role that a CFO can typically play in a larger setting. But I really thought about it as, in a company, yes, you are to an extent managing money. But if your role is to sort of take a longer perspective, think strategically about resource allocation, because startups are so risky, it's not so much about managing money, because a lot of times you don't have very much of it. It's really more about managing risk, right? In managing risk in terms of, how you spend your more important resource, which is actually really time oftentimes than money, because those two are so interrelated, and helping your team kind of figure out, all right, what bets do we want to take in terms of product, the products that we want to build, the features that we want to build, where we do want to deploy our limited capital, what sort of team members are going to be making the biggest difference, right? And inherent in a lot of that is thinking about business strategy, product market fit, and so that's, for me, one of the big differences between being a CFO in a very structured setting, right? Which is more about managing money, right? And in a startup setting, it's really taking a more holistic approach to managing risk, and principally not just around how you spend your money, but also how you spend your time. So as a CFO of a startup, that might have been my title, but like many other people in early stage business, a big part of the value and my job is how can I grow the business, right? So thinking about that in a structured way, right? Taking an analytical approach to that. What do I mean by that? Being a CFO is an inherently quantitative role, right? You're expected to have a quantitative approach to resource expenditure, and oftentimes take a look at not just sort of the dollar and cents that are coming and going and being paid and received and those types of things, but also sort of taking an operational view on that, right? Looking at the operational sort of metrics of the business, and providing that view in a fairly objective way, right? Because then and tell those facts and tell that story in a way that sort of everyone can buy into. And I was also reminded of what Peter Thiel oftentimes would write about, which is what makes a lot of founders sort of very insightful in their markets is that you can see those secrets that are hiding in plain sight, right? And so, the role of being a sort of, the CFO, at least in my view, has been not just about the dollars and cents, but also, helping reveal those types of secrets through data, through analysis. And it's not, and that applies to the market that you're in and sort of, and bringing that, perspective to bear. Because ultimately what that does is it has a big influence on how you allocate resources, right? And so from my view, all of the work that I did earlier in my 20s when I was working at sort of larger companies, for a while it didn't sort of become clear to me how that was actually that useful. I think as the years have gone on, I've become much more appreciative of sort of how I got started in a lot of those things. Because at the end of the day, startups, they are businesses as well. They're actually much harder businesses to run because oftentimes you're not even really sure what the business is quite yet, right? So you have to keep on thinking, keep on innovating, not just on your product, but sort of the business model at the same time because you're trying to find that fit there. And so as you go about that process, sort of being able to to understand business drivers, right? To understand operationally sort of what makes you stronger or weaker, being fairly detail oriented and analytical, and that just really sort of cuts down the cycle time on being able to test test and sort of get feedback on what you are doing, right? And so, that approach is also, it also has made me think, particularly the last couple of years that, oftentimes in my view, there's these conceptions about, oh, this is a technical founder, this is a business founder, and there's a little bit of segregation of roles. Um, in my view, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, right? At the end of the day, there are just certain consistencies about what makes companies after you get product market fit. But then after that, there's quite a number of just things that are true of all well-run businesses, right? And having sort of the views and on a business that at least I got to have as being the CFO, I felt like have been very useful, and also really a foundation of all of the future startups that I would be doing in the future. So yeah, so those are some of my thoughts. And you can get my contact information, find me on social media, but thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.